We are going to see important techniques in the terms of utility and validity as part of the selection process. This is interviews. Interviews used in industry differ according to their objectives. Some of the different objectives are to evaluate the candidate for purposes of hiring, promotion, or transfer. Interviews conducted for such purposes are usually referred to as selection or placement interviews. To obtain information from the interviewee concerning his attitudes about his job, the company, etc. These interviews are referred to as attitude interviews. Their purpose is to understand the person's attitudes better, even though the decision to terminate has already been made. In such situations, it is felt the interview will be more candid, hence, he may no longer feel that he must please to keep his job. Surprisingly, few individuals refuse to cooperate, probably because of the need to get it off his chest. To help the employee with any particular personal or on the job problem, which might be helpful, which might be harmful to his performance both on and off the job. These interviews are referred to as counseling interviews. Many larger firms provide services of this type for their employees, both as an individual service and in the hope that some benefit will be there for the company. In recent years, this type of interviewing has become more frequent for top executives. The assumption is that executives often operate as islands unto themselves during the business day and are not able or willing to discuss their many problems and responsibilities with associates. The interview in this setting can become a therapeutic device, allowing the individual to unload to a person who is trained to view things objectively and who will not be threatening because he has no authority to change things. However, by intuitive judgment, the idea seems to have some merit, and those who work in this area extol its virtues. If nothing else, it may save the wife and children from having to cope with the grouchy and tense husband or father returning home from a frustrating day at work, at least on those days when the counseling interview took place. To another form of interview is to evaluate the interviewee for his ability to perform under a particular set of difficult circumstances. These interviews are often called assessment or stress interviews. The interviewer deliberately provokes stressful situations with the hope of measuring a person's ability to perform under such situations. Such interviews were first popularized by the Office of Strategic Services in World War II, and variations of the stress interview are used more and more in the industry. Our present concern is primarily with the selection interview. So, thus, we will examine how the interview is used in selection process, how it compares with other selection devices, and its strengths and weaknesses. In spite of the wide increase in the use of the test as part of the selection process, testing ranks second in terms of most frequently employed selection methodologies. Do people become employed today without having experienced some type of an employment interview with one or more company representatives who do or do not know anything about conducting interviews? The selection interview is used for jobs ranging from itinerant fruit pickers in California to executive vice presidents and presidents. No one is immune from the selection interview. How extensive is interviewing in industry? Several surveys have indicated the use of selection interview to be almost universal. There is no standard time limit associated with interviews for selection purposes. The length varies depending on the type of the position, number of applicants, importance attached to the interview as a selection device, and personality of the interviewer. Our experience indicates that many employment interviews are conducted by untrained executives who believe their skill in interviewing to be exemplary. In an early study based upon only 7 employment interviews, found that the interview duration to be approximately 12 minutes with the interviewer doing most of the talking. Majority of the interviews were for factory jobs but were of other office jobs. The relation between the length of the interview and the interview value do not allow for generalization. In many interview situations, length is predetermined by an appointment schedule. College recruitment settings are typical of this fixed time basis. As will be pointed out in a later section, one important but as yet unanswered question concerns the effect of the interview length on the validity and reliability of the interview. In spite of his extensive views in employment situation, the interview has not received a great deal of attention concerning its reliability, validity, and how these attributes are affected by the type or the length of the interview itself. However, before examining the data that are available concerning these questions, it will be helpful to get a clearer picture of the role interview plays as part of the selection. The interview often is difficult to evaluate as a selection device simply because of the somewhat complex fashion in which it fits into the selection process. Firstly, it must be remembered that the basic purpose of the interviewer in any assessment interview situation is twofold: to gather as much data as one can which are relevant to the selection decision, and to evaluate the data available and decide to select or reject the applicant. The data collected during an interview depend upon the type of the interviewer, his degree of training, his biases, and the position he is attempting to fill. Thus, data collected can be collected very systematically, though the use of highly structured interview session in which a planned series of questions is presented to the applicant. On the other hand, data can be gathered in a much more open or unstructured interview in which one simply probes and explores the applicant's qualifications in a play-by-ear fashion. Perhaps the best way to view an interviewer is to envision that he acts as a sort of intuitive regression equation. His job is one of the attempting to collect, combine, and weigh the interview data in such fashion that he comes up with a prediction of how successful the applicant may be, should he be hired, the degree to which he can successfully predict eventual job success in his validity. From a theoretical viewpoint, it should be simple to evaluate empirically the validity of the interview, both in the absolute sense and in terms of its relative value to the other selection procedures. Unfortunately, such an evaluation is not as easy as it might superficially appear. A few questions of the patterned interview guide can be: what is your age? What is your educational background? Are you married? What is the size of your family? What previous work experience have you had? What type of work do you desire? What wages do you wish to earn? What are your drinking habits? What is your current financial situation? Do you like working closely with others? Many times, job applicants are required to produce some sort of documentary evidence that they performed satisfactorily in one or more of their past positions. Such evidence is usually provided in the form of a letter of recommendation or letter of reference from the previous employer to the prospective employer. These letters most often follow no special format and will vary greatly in detail and in information from writer to writer. At times, such letters or statements are highly personalized, covering the character and morals of the applicant as well as his abilities and skills. On the other hand, some letters are very limited in scope and only cover dates of employment. The difficulties with using references as guides in the selection of job applicants are many. One must always be concerned with the accuracy of the description provided in the recommendation. Letters of recommendation may be very inaccurate and misleading, giving a picture of a person that may be quite incorrect. There are perhaps four major reasons for a letter of reference to be inaccurate in content. Knowledge of the applicants may not be from letters or recommendations are provided who terminate on a voluntary basis. Such letters merely indicate that the employee was not fired and certainly are totally useless to the other employees as far as providing any real information about the applicant's talents or potential for success. Even if the employer has had sufficient exposure or contact with the worker to become familiar with its talents, then the question of the degree to which the employer is capable of getting an accurate impression of the worker. That is, how capable is the employer of accurately assessing the talents of his workers. Many people do not have the writing skill to transmit their impressions accurately to another person via letter, to the extent that the employer lacks the ability to communicate in this fashion. The accuracy of the recommendation is going to suffer. The final obstacle to the accuracy of the letter of the recommendation is probably the most serious of all. The obstacle is the reluctance on the part of the employer to portray the unfavorable aspects of those he is asked to recommend. Sometimes such reluctance arises out of a general tendency to be kind or charitable to the departing employee. In other, less frequent occasions, employer will deliberately falsify the recommendation to make the employee look very good so that another firm will hire him and the present employee will no longer be bothered with the person. In other words, employer makes a bad employee sound good just to get rid of him. No one knows how often this occurs, but the authors suspect that in such is the case is all too many instances. While the interview, the application plank, and the letters of recommendation are the major selection aids used in conjunction with tests, several other kinds of predictors have been tried in certain instances. The search for valid predictors of job success will, of course, never cease. Anything that would seem to have potential predictability will eventually be tried. However, tests and personal history data will probably continue to be the most effective predictors, and interviews and letters of recommendation, in spite of their problems and biases, will probably continue to be an integral part of the selection process.